morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us today for this 1 hour webinar organized by the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub on addressing fraud and online scams, a perennial issue that plagues any individual who carries a mobile device today. My name is Eileen, and I am the Head of Operations at the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub, and I'm being seconded by Securities Commission Malaysia. I'm pleased to let you know that the webinar today is held in conjunction with the 8th edition of the IOSCO World Investor Week. It's a week-long campaign which started yesterday to do two things. One is to raise awareness about the importance of investor education and protection, and the second is to highlight the various initiatives of securities regulators in both investor education and investor protection. So in line with this, and part of the Hub's ongoing efforts to foster collaboration and enhance regulatory capacity building for regulators, our goal today is threefold. One, we would like to shed some light of the evolving threats posed by scams and online fraud. Secondly, how effective are these fraud and scam warnings from regulators? And third, looking ahead, how can investors and regulators prepare to address these threats, and including how behavioral science can help investors make safer choices. So we have 400 people registered from 80 jurisdictions today. So your presence here really underscores the urgency of tackling this pressing issue in combating fraud and online scams. I believe almost every other day, many of us receive suspicious text messages or phone calls, often posing as legitimate organizations from banks to government agencies. Now, the sheer volume and sophistication of these attacks require us, as regulators, to be ever vigilant and proactive in our approach. So our collective response to this growing threat is crucial, and I'm confident that today's discussion will provide valuable insights and practical takeaways. Now, before we move to our panel discussion, we will be taking questions throughout the webinar as they come, so feel free to type out your questions in the Q&A chat box. Now let's get started. Please allow me to welcome Daniel Trinder, the Executive Director, Strategy and Design from the New Zealand Financial Markets Authority, as our moderator, who will then introduce the panel of speakers. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Eileen. I'm delighted to be moderating today's webinar as part of the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub webinar for World Investor Week. And I'm really excited to be joined by my distinguished panelists. So let me introduce the three panelists that you see. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Melanie Devoy. So Melanie is Director, Office of Customer Education and Outreach at the CFTC in Washington, D.C. in the US, so Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Alan Clark, who's Head of International APAC, the Behavioural Insights team based in Singapore, and Kenneth Lai, who's Director Enforcement, the Hong Kong Securities Future Commission, and also Vice Chair of IOSCO Standing Committee 4, which covers enforcement and exchange of information. So let me just say a few words by way of introduction around scams and fraud, and then I'm going to go into Q&A with the three panelists. We've had some questions asked already. Please feel free to ask other questions as we go along, and we'll do our best to address these. So scams themselves, of course, are not new. However, the technology and globalization are making it far easier for criminals intent on causing financial harm to do so. Increasingly, fraudulent activities involve sophisticated digital promotions, online marketing, etc., through the expectation of digital platforms. When investors lose money, confidence in regulators, confidence in financial institutions, and law enforcement is seriously damaged. And what we're also finding now increasingly is no longer scammers are confined to any one jurisdiction. Global cooperation amongst regulators is therefore vital for tackling risks that are often cross-border in nature. And this is where IOSCO has got a crucial role. effective cooperation amongst regulators, sharing best practice information and tools to rapidly disrupt this criminal behaviour is becoming increasingly necessary, and a collective effort to tackle the influx of investment and financial scams that too often plague our planet. And successfully tackling fraud and online scams is also an area that's got a shared objective with the private sector, and so cooperation with industry becomes crucial. So with that, let me turn to the first questions. So if we think of tackling scams both at the demand and supply perspectives, where the demand side is raising investor awareness and the supply side is having an arsenal of interventions to intervene through a complex web or syndicate in terms of sort of the various players concerned, whether they be in the financial industry itself or an internet service provider, what can regulators to do collectively to address these issues? And I guess, one angle would be at the domestic level, so regulators, ISPs, social media platforms, etc. Would, for example, establishing a national scam centre be one solution? And then secondly, think of this in terms of the international level, and perhaps here IOSCO. So maybe Kenneth, given your role at IOSCO, we could start with you, and then perhaps Melanie, we could ask you to chip in to get your perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Just to answer your question about sort of international, the international response, if I would like to draw everybody's attention to a statement issued by the IOSCO board back in December 2023. The purpose of that statement essentially is to address the question that Daniel has just posed. How can regulators around the world sort of react to the threat of online harm, both internationally and domestically? The statement actually is divided into three parts. The first part, it's directed at investors. So it's intended to raise awareness, basically calling on all retail investors to be vigilant about the latest trends. And that sort of deals with your, I think what you said is the demand side. But of course, raising investor awareness is just half the battle. We have the very nature of online harm or online threat. It's that the bad actors are hidden behind the internet, the veil of the internet. It's very difficult to find out who the masterminds truly are, where they're located, and with the advent of Bitcoin and other crypto payment methods, it's becoming increasingly difficult in some cases to even trace the payment and to stop the dissipation of assets. So the second part of the IOSCO statement is actually a call on regulators around the world to basically push the regulatory limit to both domestically as well as when they are helping each other in cross-boundary investigatory assistance issues. So for those who are not familiar with IOSCO and the investigatory assistance that securities regulators assist each other with, under the IOSCO framework, members of IOSCO, there are over 130 members today. Securities regulators who have signed up have committed to providing the fullest assistance permissible under their laws to assist each other in gathering evidence to fight securities crime. And that includes securities crime basically conducted on the internet through online means. So that's the second part of the IOSCO statement. The third part of the IOSCO statement, I think it's actually one of the most critical part of that statement. It's a call on basically all stakeholders in the internet ecosystem, and that means the likes of Meta, Google, TikTok, and the social media platforms, or the digital services platforms, to cooperate with securities regulators and law enforcement agencies to play their role, play their part in sort of protecting investors from harm. So it's a three-pronged approach: warning to investors, calling on regulators to cooperate more fully and purposefully with each other, and thirdly, to engage with or calling on stakeholders in the internet ecosystem to play their part in helping to fight this problem. So I guess that I hope that answers your question on what regulators can do both domestically and internationally.
Thank you. Melanie, would you like to add some thoughts into that?
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. And I would like to thank organizers for allowing me to participate in this event. This is my first World Investor Week, and it is my first World Investor Week event. So I'm thrilled to be here. Before I answer your question, I have to give a disclaimer. Because I work for the federal government, the views that I am about to share are my own and not those of anyone else at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And to answer your question, I really like the way you phrased it. I was an undergraduate economics major, and so always thinking about demand and supply. So for the demand side, the way the CFTC is approaching it is that we're trying to go where the potential victims are and provide information there, as opposed to expecting victims to find our anti-victimization resources, which are available on cftc.gov/learn and protect. We have a fraud center. So if you're interested in learning about the various types of fraud that are impacting the CFTC's jurisdictional area, I would encourage you to look at that. However, we also have had several discussions in my IOSCO committee, it's Committee C8 for retail investors, about how we cannot expect potential victims to find these resources prior to being victimized. So what we're trying to do is get the information, deliver it right to them. So one thing that we did just last month, we partnered with some local law enforcement, and we went to visit an Asian American community that we know had been targeted for a particular type of fraud. So we organized an outreach event, and we actually went to them and provided a presentation, and they were extremely, the recipients were extremely receptive to the news. And we brought, we explained the fraud and the warning signs of the fraud. And then we asked them to share that information with at least one other person. So I think that is, it's a time-consuming way to get the information out there, but I think it's also very effective. The second thing we're doing is we're partnering, and this is new for the CFTC. We're a financial regulator, and we typically, regulate futures, options, and swaps. So a lot of what we are doing is dealing with very sophisticated entities. However, when we have a futures contract, like we do in Bitcoin and Ethereum, we have anti-fraud jurisdiction over that underlying commodity class. So this puts us in a different situation from what we normally would be doing. So we're really trying to work with partners, both at other regulatory and law enforcement agencies, and even with private sector partners. Just in September, we launched an anti-victimization tool. It's a one-page infographic, which you can find at cftc.gov/learn and protect under learning resources. And this one-page bank brochure has a bunch of federal seals on it. And we partnered with the American Banking Association to put this out, as well as the FBI. So this is a tool that we're, instead of providing directly to the victims, we're providing to the people who are probably the last stop before the victim hands their money over to the fraudster. So those are two examples of what we're doing for the demand side. Now, on the supply side, we found that the more we partner with other agencies, the more of an impact we can have on the scammers. And what is complicated in the United States is we have so many federal agencies and they have so many different jurisdictions that the type of fraud we're seeing, and we're going to talk about a particular fraud, we call it crypto investment fraud or relationship confidence fraud, but the perpetrators call it pig butchering fraud. It's a very complicated fraud we will discuss, but it's one that impacts the jurisdiction of multiple agencies. So what we're learning is that domestically, we need to partner and figure out how each agency can bring its various jurisdictional tools to the table. And we also need to partner to understand the technology options that can prevent the scammers from contacting the victims. So in July, we hosted a federal conference with DOJ's National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team to get everyone in the same room. There were also a lot of virtual participants, but we literally discussed people's jurisdiction, what they were seeing. And as a result, we formed a bunch of our 4 working groups to try to deal with the fraud. We formed an outreach group, a technological disruption group, an enforcement group, and a group that's focused on private-public partnerships. So we're hopeful that using these groups and working together will have a more effective outreach. And the final thing I'll mention, I know I'm going a little long, is that my agency has a special tool called the Whistleblower Program. So this is a tool where we can alert potential whistleblowers to information that would be useful to our agency. And we do this through something called the Whistleblower Alert. And in 2022, we put out a whistleblower alert on these crypto investment frauds, which the perpetrators call pig butchering. So that's something I would encourage you to look at. You can find it on whistleblower.gov under whistleblower alerts. And so this is a potential avenue for someone with knowledge about fraud to come to the CFTC as a whistleblower. If the information they provide leads to a successful enforcement action, the CFTC can pay whistleblowers 10 to 30% of what we collect. So that's a real incentive where we're trying to pull information that will help us stop these frauds to us.
Thank you, Melanie. Let me just pick up on what you said about the tools there. How effective are fraud scam warnings from regulators? Is there a complementary approach to strengthen how warnings are given to investors?
So I think the warnings that we put on our websites, our respective websites, they're very well written and the content is very good. However, the fraud warnings in the United States are dispersed across various different agencies. And I fear we've been discussing this in my IOSCO committee. We fear that the people who need the fraud warnings the most are not finding them before they're victimized. So what we think we need to do is bring the message to the potential victims. And we're thinking creatively. Again, these are my comments and not those of the CFTC, but we are considering how the private sector is getting messages to the public, such as one thing that happens in the United States, it might happen everywhere, but if you want to watch content, such as on YouTube, you have to watch, or at least I have to watch an ad before I can get to the content I want. So, we're actively talking to people about what could we do to create a little bit of friction and get the knowledge out to the customer or the potential victim before they're harmed. So we have actually contracted with an advertising company that is hopefully going to help us take that great content that's on cftc.gov/learn and protect and deliver it directly to the potential victims.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Kenneth, your perspective around this, about the effectiveness of warnings?
Yeah, I mean, the effectiveness of warnings has actually been discussed at IOSCO Committee 4, the Committee for Enforcement Cooperation, quite regularly. And I think the general consensus is what works for one jurisdiction may not work for another. And what works for one sort of demographic group may not work for yet another. So that goes to the point that of what Melanie just mentioned. We really have to find ways to deliver the message to the targeted audience. So identifying the targeted audience is important. So just to give you an example, when we discussed this at IOSCO, a person from Ireland said, the most effective way to disseminate an anti-fraud, anti-scam message in Ireland is actually to just put it on the radio. It's not the internet, it's not TV, it's not any other form, because people drive to work and they listen to the radio. And that's the most effective way to deal with, to disseminate that message. And for a place like Hong Kong, a lot of us take the mass transit railway. So the most effective way is to put up posters, every few meters, at MTR mass transit railway stations. And I think the approach varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and I think C8 and IOSCO is doing some wonderful work in sort of providing guidance to members on how to approach this, and I think basically tailoring the strategy for the jurisdiction, for the target audience, is the key.
Thank you. Maybe at this stage, Alex, I can bring you in and ask you again around not just the effectiveness, but also whether there are other complementary methods that need to be used.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would certainly echo some of the points that Melanie and Kenneth have already made, both in terms of, as a starting point, I think the evidence does suggest that warnings have an effect, which is a good starting point. And an important thing for us to confirm. I think the challenge is, how do we get the right warnings to the right people, firstly? And secondly, and this is sort of where we start to dive more into the behavioral science, how do we make sure that people pay attention to those warnings? And that really is the challenge. I mean, we all have attentional biases which drive sort of where we're focusing and where we're maybe not paying as much attention as we should. And this is a real problem with fraud, which is particularly with these kind of investment frauds that we're thinking about here, where overconfidence is a massive determinant of people's susceptibility to this. And that's going to connect with your tendency to ignore information. If you have high confidence in your own abilities, you're going to see a fraud advertisement and think, well, that doesn't apply to me. So there's sort of two things. One sort of more directly complementary when we're thinking about warnings. There's a lot of really good evidence now about inoculation approaches, or what's sometimes described as pre-bunking. The sort of the lay explanation of this is the best way to identify who is susceptible to scams is to run your own scam. We've actually done this both within organizations and with governments, with the public, where we, for example, in France, ran a retail scam on Facebook, where we offered a very attractively priced coffee machine, and used that to recruit people for educational interventions. The wonderful thing about this is that the people you're looking for self-select into your message. So I think thinking sort of innovatively about how we get these warnings to people, and using what behavioral science tells us about how people pay attention is one part of it. The other part of it, which I think is really important, is thinking about when we want people to see that information. There is a half-life, and I think the evidence does tend to show where you're looking at longer-term measures, there is a half-life of these warnings, right? They wear off over time. People can't hold all the information in their heads forever. And so really what I think the most exciting research that I've been seeing in this space is all about how do we get the right information about fraud and scams to people when they're being sort of fished for on social media, with labels around that, around these kinds of posts, or when they're going through the process of adding a payee on their banking app. These are the moments where we want to be serving people personalized risk warnings, that taking advantage of our attentional bias to pay attention to information that's personal to us, in order to disrupt that flow, and thinking about it in terms of sort of these behavioral steps people are taking to think, okay, how do I introduce the warning, not in a general sense, not in a broad blast sense, but to the specific person at the moment when they're considering making a bad decision, in the hope that we can steer and divert them. And we've released a report that from a study we did earlier this year with Ontario Securities Commission that specifically looks at and tests the effectiveness of these kinds of approaches. And whereas a generic warning or a more generic warning in advance has a sort of 10% effect, disrupting that process, we're looking at effect size more like a 30% change. It's much more effective, which makes sense because you're giving people the information they need to make the decision at the moment they're making the decision.
Thank you, Alex. Can I just pick up on just taking this further down the line around sort of the victims, and thinking of how as a regulator you deal with victims, and particularly frontline staff that are having to communicate with them. Perhaps, Melanie, I can pick up with you. What are some of the trainings that you give staff to deal with people who may well have lost all of their life savings through some sort of scam?
Thanks for the question, Daniel. And I'm finding this conversation very interesting. I really appreciate hearing everything people are sharing. So my agency has developed a series of materials to warn potential victims about fraud. I'll mention it again at cftc.gov/learn and protect, and you can see our resources. Now, one thing we stress in those materials is that victims can be re-victimized. And I wanted to take the opportunity to share that what we're seeing and what we're telling and messaging to potential victims, and hopefully the victims are seeing this, is that once you're victimized in one of these frauds, there's a big chance that you will be re-victimized through something called a recovery fraud, where you're going to be approached by someone who says they can get your money back. So we're warning people about that. And then the second component we're warning people about is that these victims are asked to be money mules, which means that they're asked to open up clean banking accounts or clean digital asset wallet accounts. So I wanted to point that out, that we're really trying to provide messaging to the victims. However, to answer your specific question about dealing with victims, I've had the opportunity to do it in various jobs that I've had, and it is very difficult. I think that, unfortunately, I'm still staffing up, but we don't have someone in that victim resource role yet. But I know that at other federal agencies, such as the Department of Justice, they have a victim resource specialist group. So whenever you are dealing with a victim, that victim specialist will kind of be the interface between the attorney and the victim, and stand in the middle and remind an attorney like me about how sensitive the victim may be because of what just happened. We also have private organizations in the United States, such as the American Association for Retired Persons, AARP, that has developed a series of victim resources. So there are resources out there, both in the private sector and at certain federal agencies. However, I do want to stress that this is a very on-point question, because the fraud that we're seeing, particularly this crypto investment fraud that we're about to talk about, has long-term impacts on the victims. We are seeing in the news reports of victims committing suicide because of the fraud. So I can't underestimate the importance of having that victim resource training for your staff who are dealing with these victims.
I share everything you just said there, Melanie. Totally agree. You made that point very, very well. Alex, can I come back to you just on some of the behavioural aspects you touched on, and you talked about some work you've done for the Ontario Securities regulator, but the general point, I think, is behavioural science is increasingly being used to support the public in preventing fraud. So can you elaborate what good looks like in this case, and maybe give some examples of behavioural informed strategies that might be more effective in helping investors recognize and avoid online scams?
Certainly. So I think the core premise with when taking a behavioral science approach to any kind of public policy or social issue, challenge around the social issue, is that we want to better understand the decision-making process so that we can help people make better decisions. And I think that's really crucial with thinking about our responses and our strategy to scams. I mean, I think that a lot of regulators that work in this space have quite a good intuitive understanding of what's driving these kind of problems. So, and I saw some of the questions that people submitted, right? There's an understanding that urgency is a big part of what drives people to make maybe less optimal decisions in these scam situations. Scammers are really good at creating this atmosphere of urgency. But I think that, the behavioral science can help us understand why that happens, or why that makes a difference, right? Which is all to do with how your brain is wired to pay attention to scarcity. It's to do with how our brains are designed to, focus our attention in moments of urgency. At the same time, another kind of really important characteristic we need to understand, as I've mentioned previously with scams, is overconfidence. And I think that's very interesting when we think about, potentially, approaches around financial literacy, right? Which I think a lot of regulators kind of look to as a way to, help the public, navigate this increasingly complicated, scam-littered online world in particular. But the challenge is that, there's certainly a kind of a clear correlational relationship between higher financial literacy and fraud threat, although I would say the evidence is a little bit mixed about that, probably because, there's a big difference between actual financial literacy and perceived financial literacy. And then that's actually our definition, of the working definition we use for overconfidence, right? If you think you're a 7 out of 10, you're actually a 5 out of 10. if you're in that situation, you are more at risk of fraud of almost anyone else, especially with these kind of investment frauds, which we're seeing more and more of. So I think what good looks like is, carrying out that, taking as your starting point this idea that we don't know exactly what works to solve this problem. I think is it should be a core of both behavioral science and evidence-based policymaking, and then carrying out research to try and understand what drives this decision, and therefore, what can prevent it. And so, mentioning again, the work with the Ontario Securities Commission, we read the work that we did earlier, released earlier this year, was all about the use of AI, generative AI, in scams. And there's a huge amount that we've learned in carrying out this experimental research about how much more effective scams are when they use AI. We do see significant differences in efficacy, their ability to lure and trap their victims. But as I say, you also can test out what works to prevent it. And what came through really clearly from this work on AI enabled scams is you can get a little bit of an effect by inoculating people, by warning them in advance in effective ways which grab their attention. But you get, I think, a much stronger effect from as I say, something that provides that information in the moment. So if it's a social media ad trying to recruit someone into a crypto scam, a little label that says there's a high risk that AI was used in this. Little things like that, I think, could be very, very effective. And similarly, there's some really great work that I saw that was released last year, where the researchers worked on what do you say to a customer if you're a bank. What do you say to a customer during the transaction process to prevent them making a bad choice, and providing an off ramp during that decision to make a transaction is extremely effective when within the lab testing, certainly, in terms of like getting people out of that situation. But you have to think about how you provide that information really carefully. Like, personalization makes a big difference. You can't have these generic messages because people just get used to clicking through them and fire them away, which means the sort of back end of that is we don't just need to get the message in the right place. We don't need to get the message right, but we also need to do the kind of work, and I think in particular the data science, in order to work out, do the sort of legwork and figure out what these scams look like so that we can warn people appropriately. I think that the biggest error we would make is in relying too much on financial literacy, on very broad blast, repeated kind of general warnings to pay attention, to be afraid, because I think the reality is that people can't hold and retain this information. So I think doing the rigorous research work to figure out how people make these decisions and then testing what works to change those decisions is absolutely paramount for a behavioral issue like this.
Thank you, Alex. You've touched on one of the questions we had from India around AI, but maybe I could broaden this out a little bit further and ask you, Melanie, just looking to the future, what do you see as the most emerging threats in terms of online investment scams and frauds? And the supplementary is, how do investors and regulators therefore address some of these threats?
Thank you for the question, Daniel. And, my answer is going to go towards AI. So in terms of the most significant emerging threats in online investment scams and fraud, it is the use of artificial intelligence. I had no idea until I saw a presentation at a conference as to how sophisticated this AI-enabled images and voices are. We actually saw, and I may get this wrong, but just with a very short amount of seconds of someone's voice recording and talking, the AI system is able to clone their voice and their lip movement and how they appear, it is insane. And I've heard that we could make Daniel look like a beautiful blonde woman using AI. I mean, so just knowing it sounds like a beautiful blonde woman. So just knowing that capability is out there is paramount. And I think that what Kenneth said was right. Like, the more people are aware that this technology exists, the more they'll think, oh, maybe that's AI. Because that's not our first thought. This is so new. We don't assume that. So as I said, so deepfake technology can clone a person's image and voice. And what I've heard repeatedly is that artificial intelligence will make a good criminal a professional one. So that's the bad news. And I think that's the biggest emerging threat in online scam and fraud. If someone who's a criminal has access to this technology, they can make the work of scamming someone. They could even perhaps use an AI bot to scam someone up to a certain level. I read a book where they were talking about how there's technology out there that's so advanced that one AI bot can act in a defensive posture against something like business email compromise scams and just like, pretend to be human. So that's the good news too. So AI is the good news as well for the regulators. To the extent that we can figure out how to use it and get the authorization to use it, I think that it's going to be a massive tool in preventing investment scams and fraud. This is because we can train the AI to look for patterns. In the frauds, we're seeing definite patterns that are unmistakable. If we can use AI to help the banks detect that fraud or to help the regulators detect that in trading patterns or whatnot, I think the more we're going to be able to prevent victimization. But we will always need to use education as a tool. And we're going to need to use that education in a timely and targeted manner to potential victims to prevent them from falling prey to online investment scams and fraud. And perhaps we can use AI for that as well. So AI is both our threat and our promise.
Thank you. And Kenneth, would you share that view looking forward?
Yes, indeed. When I'm listening to Melanie, I just keep nodding my head. I think the greatest threat, it's basically the continuous improvement in the way fraudsters keeps refining their technique, keeps making use of the latest trend to capitalize on those trends, to invoke human fear, greed, and that sense of urgency that Alex had alluded to basically to commit the same underlying crime, which is to get you to wire your money either to a fraudulent investment or directly to the fraudster's account. And I think an AI is making these efforts a lot more successful. So impersonation of famous people it's actually becoming so easy these days and so scalable. I think a few months ago we had the entire or a number of senior SFC staff being sort of cloned in a video sort of posted on a social media website or social media platform, encouraging the Hong Kong public to invest in a certain investment. And I guess what do we do when the bad actors can produce 5 different videos in an hour. Taking them down takes us a few days. So how do we sort of react to that? And that really creates a lot of stress for regulators around the world. How to take it down, how to build those relationships with the digital platforms to take down fraudulent posts that are basically generated using AI. And I think the behavioral problem that Alex had mentioned, it's another challenge for a regulator. Human behavior doesn't change, and I think the bad actors, basically are repeatedly playing on the same human vulnerability, assisted by AI, assisted by the imagination, and regulators, particularly from an enforcement perspective, we're typically reactive. And I think to fight this battle, regulators have to take a proactive approach. And I think that is what IOSCO is trying to push with its online harm statement published about a year ago, to rally the whole ecosystem, all domestic law enforcement agencies, to take a proactive approach to disrupt these behavior. And that includes what Alex had mentioned. How do we introduce sort of an off-ramp or a disruption sort of mechanism into payment? And all these are being considered at different level at IOSCO. How can we do that? I mean, it's obviously much easier said than done. But I think you'll see that is the general direction that security regulators will be moving towards. But I think our greatest challenge is how to move at a faster pace than the bad actors are innovating. Thank you.
So just to remind the audience, we've got about 15 minutes left. We're coming now almost to the questions that people have posed before, but please do post any questions if you'd like us to try and pick up on them. If I can just come on now, maybe Alex, to you. Kenneth just talked about some of the psychological issues. So maybe a few questions for you to answer. First one is some of the tactics being deployed. What should regulators do to leverage behavioral science to counter these tactics? I think would be the first one. And the second one, what are some of the ways in which the authorities can make raising complaints more accessible to the public?
Yeah, two big important questions. In terms of the tactics that are being used, I think there is a wide range. That would almost be a whole hour talk in of itself. There's the use of kind of messenger effects around authority, especially using AI. Relevant to the example that Kenneth gave. There's the point I mentioned earlier about a sense of urgency. It does change the way that we consider information and make decisions when we're put under time pressure. I think some of the submissions from participants today referred to fear of missing out. That is a relevant point. In terms of what we can do about those, I mean, it really varies, I think, from place to place. I think the key thing that I would say is that we want to kind of categorize classes of scam response behaviors together, and think about these in terms of a set of behavioral steps, identifying the biases that are taking place at each of those steps, and then target in response to those. So one of the things when we do we work with governments all over the world around, a variety of different topics, including this, and, also wider financial behaviors. And the way we do that is often, relatively similar in the sense that the first thing we do is a bunch of research to understand what are the steps in completing this behavior, what are the biases that occur in each one. And then you really need to think about tailored solutions based on the problems that you're actually trying to solve for someone in terms of the information they need in order to make a more effective decision, or the process they need in order to make a more effective decision. So I wish I could give a sort of single glib silver bullet, but I'm afraid, my answer is basically, there's a lot of different techniques and tactics that are being used there that scammers have over the course of tens of thousands of trial and error efforts learned a lot about, and we are playing catch up, I think is the reality. So that's on the first point. The second point about, reporting, I'd almost frame it in a similar way. I've spoken to a couple of different authorities about this issue about reporting. And what's really interesting is, I think, sometimes we're constrained by our own processes and procedures a little bit. I've spoken to police forces where they say, oh, well, we can't have anonymous reports because otherwise we can't make a police report. And I'm totally sympathetic to where they're coming from on that, right? Because their conception of what reporting is, but we need to think really carefully about what we're trying to achieve with these reports. Because actually, I think a lot of securities regulators in particular think, actually, I'd be fine with lots of anonymous reports, because what I really want to know is what is the landscape right now in terms of it. Like, I don't care how many police reports I make. And I do think that anonymity for me is actually potentially in some cases an underused tool that I think could be really important for getting people to speak up, because there is a lot of stigma, and it's a real shame, because these scams are so sophisticated. No one has any reason to feel bad about being tricked by an AI generated video of a real civil servant or whatever it might be. But people do feel a sense of shame. People feel like they ought to have known better. So I think the anonymity, firstly thinking carefully about what reports we're trying to generate and what the barriers to those specific reports are, what kind of data are we trying to get, I think is really important. And then anonymity, I think, is in some cases an underused tool for us to help achieve that. But then the other part of it is very much what Melanie has been referring to throughout, which is you've got to make it easy for people. You have to find ways to make it easy for people to find this opportunity to tell us what's going on. And I think thinking more carefully about not just what do we want out of this, but also thinking about what a victim, a sort of scam survivor might want. One thing that I've been sort of toying with recently is this idea of setting up the tool less as report the scam and more as, if you've been scammed, this tool will tell you what you can do next. Because a lot of people almost the moment they send the money, they know. A lot of people, and then they think, I have no idea what to do now. And I'm upset, and I feel this stigma, and I don't know what to do. And I think that in those situations, if we had, AdWords that are picking up people who are saying, I've been scammed, what do I do? And it could get some information from them on an anonymous basis, but also tell them what their options are and tell them who they should be speaking to. Do you go make a fuss at your bank? Actually, are what we're seeing from you suggesting that that's not going to be a very useful way for you to proceed? I think this is really important as well. But I'd say, I'm sort of trying to combine my answers here a little bit. But I think the process for both of these problems, and really the way that we apply behavioral science to all the policy problems we work on is similar. It's all about identifying the specific behavioral steps, and thinking about what the specific biases or barriers to good behavior are, and then targeting those in a rigorous research-led way.
Thank you, Alex. And I think to your point, that the people not alone, you just have to look at a number of the very well-known celebrities who've been scammed, who've gone public on it. Melanie, can I just pick up finally on two parts for you? You've talked about some of the trends in scams. Could you just say a little bit more about the rise of pig butchering scams? And also, once a scam is identified, how do you actually go through the mechanism of communicating to all the parties involved, whether it be social media, banking, finance, so they're aware and can adapt their practices?
Thank you very much for the question, Daniel. So in the United States, and I'm sure in several other jurisdictions, we are having a problem with these pig butchering scams. We don't like to use that term, but that's what the perpetrators call it. These are highly sophisticated scams that could dupe anyone. Even if you have a PhD, if you're a medical doctor, a mathematician, anyone can fall prey to these, because what is happening is we have organized crime syndicates who have developed a psychological playbook to use against their victims. And so if you're familiar with boiler room frauds, that was like the version 1.1 of these scams, where they're in the boiler room case, they had like a playbook, like if the person says X, tell them Y. This is much more sophisticated. This is like version 100. So there's an organized crime syndicate. They're using a very sophisticated playbook. And unfortunately, the United Nations has reported that they're using human trafficking victims to commit the fraud. So it's a very sad story where we have victims on both sides. But just to warn everyone listening about how it starts very simply. And it happens to me all the time. I get a wrong number text. Someone's always asking me to play golf or go to lunch. Those are the two things that I keep getting. And so you, being a nice person, might respond and say, oh, sorry, wrong number. But then the person on the other side is trained to get you to have a long-term conversation with them. And they'll be like, oh, well, how's your day going? What is your name? And if you respond, and a lot of people in the United States are lonely and they will respond, then the person starts to build this like spider nest where they trap you. And their whole purpose is to get you to trust them. This could be a romantic trust, or it could be just a simple friendship. But that simple approach of the wrong number text, you meet someone on a dating app or on a social media app, and then it's off to the races. The fraudster is going to try to convince you that they're, your new best friend or your new love interest. And then eventually they will talk to you about investing in something that will make you rich. What my agency is seeing is a lot of investment scams related to cryptocurrencies. So if someone has an aunt or uncle who knows how to trade cryptocurrencies and it's a sure thing, you're going to 100% be guaranteed to make money, be very cautious. That's most likely a fraud. And then once the victim gives their money, they are shown a very elaborate website where it looks like they are making money. So the victim might start off with a small transaction, and then they may actually be able to withdraw some money, but the scammer will convince them over time to invest more and more and more. We're actually hosting a World Investor Week today, where we have a professor discussing the pattern of this fraud. And if you go to cftc.gov and look at our press releases, you could attend this webinar. It's at 12:30 Eastern in about 5 hours. But there's a distinct pattern to the fraud where the transactions start small and they grow over time. So that is really what we're seeing. And at the end of the scam, the victims are left both bankrupt and brokenhearted. And as I said, we're seeing some suicides as a result of this. We're also seeing massive money flows leaving the United States and going to these scam centers, which are popping up worldwide. It's a very lucrative fraud for the bad guys. So I do encourage you to warn people in your jurisdictions, both about the fraud, the investment fraud, and about the human trafficking fraud, where they'll be told they're given a very lucrative job. I'm mindful we're out of time. So just to go to your next question, how do we communicate with various parties? That's a little tricky for us, because if we have an enforcement investigation, that information is non-public and we can't share it. However, what my office has done is we've created a private public working group to open up these conversations with the social media companies, and the dating companies, and the various internet providers, to start having conversations about this topic.
Thank you, Melanie. If I can just quickly, there's been 2 questions in the chat function. Kenneth, would you mind taking the second of these 2 on the IOSCO board statement? Thank you.
Yeah. So the question I understand is whether efforts have actually gone ahead to reach out to digital platforms around the world. I think I just want to make it clear, the statement actually, it's a call on securities regulators to bring in everyone in the ecosystem. So I think my understanding is some jurisdictions have actually reached out to internet platform companies, and in terms of the response, it basically, there have been some successes, and there are also not so successful stories, and success and failure sort of varies across jurisdictions. I'm not about to name any names, given this is a public event. And I think IOSCO is aware of the situation, and there have been discussions, and just I guess all I can say is watch this space. I think there will be more to come, but of course, what will come from the IOSCO board, and not from me or from Committee 4. So watch that space. But my understanding is, to answer the question directly, some jurisdictions or some IOSCO members have reached out, and there are success and failure stories. Thank you,
Kenneth. Thank you, Kenneth. And very lastly from me, there's one other question around investor education material. Could I just signpost on the IOSCO website, there is a investor education gateway that's designed to that. And then secondly, within the Asia Pacific region, I know that there's also some work being undertaken, not just through the hub in Kuala Lumpur, but the Monetary Authority of Singapore are engaged on capacity building, particularly around scams. So please reach out to me if you'd like me to put you in touch with our colleagues in Singapore. Eileen, thank you. Thank you to Melanie, Kenneth, and Alex. We're out of time, but I really hope that this would sound that useful. I certainly did.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you again to Melanie and Kenneth and Alex for spending your hour with us. Ladies and gentlemen, once this webinar ends, there will be a post survey pop-up. It's a very quick survey. If you could just take 10 seconds of your time to complete 3 very simple questions as a feedback to today's webinar. I also want to highlight that there is a second World Investor Week global webinar, which will take place an hour after this. It will delve into topics of sustainable finance as well as crypto and digital assets. So please visit the World Investor Week website to join the upcoming webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.